Director of Marketing for Viewabill. With us today is Ken Grady. Ken is considered a legal evangelist and has been recognized by the Financial Times for changing the rules of engagement with external advisors. He helps lawyers better understand how technological, social, and business forces are creating disruption in traditional service industries, and he works with them to develop and implement solutions to take advantage of untapped opportunities. I know that's a mouthful, but it really cuts to the heart of what you do. And with us also is Robbie Friedman. Robbie is the CEO and co-founder of Viewabill. Viewabill is a cloud-based solution that enables law firms to share pre-bill activity in real time in order to build strong attorney-client relationships. And the topic of the discussion today is a topic that probably doesn't get enough elucidation because it is, I suppose, a subtopic of a larger discussion between the great argument over the billable hour and alternative fee arrangements. And the subtopic that I refer to is shadow billing. Shadow billing is a term that's used to kind of track the hours, even though a firm wouldn't be billing by the hour, still the hours are and activities are tracked as if it was a billable hour arrangement, and that's a topic that, no pun intended, I think is overshadowed by the larger billable hour argument and doesn't get enough elucidation. I thought that it might be a good thing for us to talk about. Ken, I know you have some very strong opinions on the billable hour and shadow billing, and Robbie as well. We have our software really is designed to help clients track billable hours. So I thought bringing both of you together might really shed some light on this discussion of the shadow billing process. Ken, maybe you might start with just maybe a couple minutes a preface about your philosophy behind the billable hour, and then we can get Robbie's opinion about that, and then we can branch off into the shadow billing discussion.
Sure, thanks. The billable hour, obviously has been around for a long time, and it's an established fixture in the world of law firms and corporations and even smaller law practices. But the issue that I have and others have with the billable hour is it's really a measure of effort that is used to accomplish something rather than a measure of value. And so, and I'll give a bit more on that, but because it's an effort, not value measure, it's something that doesn't really help either the producer, the law firm, or the buyer, the client, in looking at what's being done, the service, and then taking it apart and finding ways to make it more efficient. So by effort measure, we mean we're simply tracking how much time somebody spends doing things. We're not looking at the content that's produced during that time, even when we try and do it using various billing codes or other measures. We really don't understand well what's being done during that unit of time that we're measuring. We don't have good ways to compare what's being done by a lawyer during that unit of time to another lawyer, whether it's in the same firm, a different firm, and even that lawyer from day 1 to day 2. So it's just simply effort. We know that they spent 3 hours doing something, and we really don't understand what the something was during that time. When we look at value, we're looking at what is the content, the substantive content of what's occurred, and whether that value is meaningful to the client. So I may have spent 3 hours doing something, and 10 minutes of that was actually value, and the rest of it was waste. In an effort model, that's very difficult to determine to impossible. In a value model, it's easier to determine, and it makes it a lot easier for us to start focusing on efficiency. So that's sort of a philosophical view of effort doesn't really get us much and it impedes us doing a lot of improvements, and in particular in lean thinking, which is where I tend to focus. Value focuses us on the substantive content, the thing that we really want to get to, and helps drive us to get more efficient, really do that value content. So in a broad stroke, that's why we tend to, I tend to, and others tend to look towards value versus effort.
Thanks. And sorry?
Yeah, go ahead, Robbie. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So, and Ken, thank you for that. You know, I agree with you that billable hour might not be the best measure of value. It might also not be the best measure of effort, you know, especially if we consider how much of our time is spent multitasking, you know, keeping an eye on email, etc. You know, even time has become difficult to measure. When I think of the billable hour, you know, whether or not it's the best metric, what it does have going for it is that it is an objective unit for somebody to measure. And, you know, an hour could go further with one person than another, but at least there is an objective anchor, you know, by which to measure. And everybody is able to measure hours. Whether they then want to apply something that will tell how valuable those hours are, you know, then we start to get into value and subjectivity. You know, when I think of the billable hour, I wonder to myself and out loud, how could we get away from an objective measurement and go to something that is as subjective as, you know, what value has been created? And for that reason, I think that until we find a better objective standard or unit of measurement, the billable hour plays a key role in the attorney-client relationships.
Well, I guess a couple of things. I would argue that, in fact, the hour is a highly subjective and not objective measurement, and that value goes from the premise that you should use, and if done properly, is a highly objective level of measurement, not subjective. And what I mean by that is, I'll go back to where I started. Two people put an hour on their timesheet. One person spent the last 60 seconds working, one person spent 59 minutes of the hour working. The objective, quote unquote, measurement of an hour is a false objectivity because they didn't do the same thing. It just happens to be a unit that you can write down. And in fact, if we actually do the studies, we find that people are very bad at measuring the amount of time that they have spent doing things. So even that objectivity, the self-reporting system, tends to be very poor. What we've done in a host of industries and have done successfully in other business adventures is to say, let's look at the objective content, what actually happens. So, and this is where I will admit it gets very confusing because I will talk about hours, and so people immediately think about billable hours when I say this. But I'll give an example. When I learned lean, I worked in a manufacturing facility. I ran a manufacturing facility. We would keep track of time all the time, but we would do it through an objective measure. A third party would measure, would observe the activities done. They would clock the time being spent. They would then look at all the other inputs to the process. You would roll that up and you'd say, this is the total input into producing the product. And based on that input and recognizing this is what the market will pay to achieve that product, we could figure out how much money would be left as our profit. If we wanted to make more money, we had to figure out how to reduce the input cost so there was more money left over for us based on the price at which we could sell. So if you looked at the practice of law, we can actually determine content through a number of different measures. We can determine other inputs to the process and get a much better objective evaluation of the content going in than simply time, because as I said, the time doesn't reflect anything about the content there. It's a false measure of objectivity reported by a person. If I sit there at my desk for 45 minutes and I realize 45 minutes has gone by and I've been sort of fiddling around with something and now I finish it up, it may be an hour that gets recorded on the timesheet, but a third party wouldn't say, I've just put an hour of content into it.
And I think that something that you touched upon, Ken, that is, I think, important for us all to realize is that, even with the billable hour, an hour as a unit of measurement could be an objective measurement, but the input and the person who's recording what that hour is, that person is not objective. That person exercises some subjectivity to say, I spent an hour on this, or I spent 6 minutes on it. So I do agree fully that subjectivity exists within the context of the billable hour. I guess the subjectivity in an alternative fee arrangement switches from the timekeeper to the the process or the client, or and you probably disagree that there's subjectivity there anyways, but there's always going to be some subjectivity in this process. I think that's important for us to call out.
I think what I would say makes this confusing is we look at today's model for how we do things. So we look at today, we have the predominant model being record your time, multiply it times a rate, add all that up, and this is how we charge for things. We're comfortable with that. It's been done for a while, and it, as I say, it adds what I would call false objectivity, but it adds this feeling like it's this numerical quantifiable thing, because we take one number, we multiply it times another number. That sounds very concrete to us. When we talk about value in another context, it sounds like it becomes mystical. But in most other things, when we talk about the value of a product, the value of a car, the value of a service, it's not mystical. It's just been derived in a way that we as lawyers are not used to. We're not used to looking at the inputs, measuring the cost of those inputs as opposed to what we'll charge for them, adding up the cost. If I'm doing work for a law firm and I am an associate, I cost the firm X amount per unit of time. So if I spend 6 minutes doing something, we can calculate what the cost to the firm of that 6 minutes was to do something. And if we're doing value stream mapping and we're looking at the content of what I'm doing and we're trying to weed out the waste, things that don't add any value to the client, and streamline the process just like every other business and industry does, we can end up with, this is what the cost is of my time and the other inputs. We add those up and we say, here's the cost of the service. It costs the firm X amount of dollars to provide that service. And then the firm can choose how much of a margin it thinks it would like to have on it. And the way that I look about doing that is more of a lean method, which is to say, if the market will pay me $20,000 and it's going to cost me $16,000, cost me $16,000, I have $4,000 left over. If I can get the cost down to $12,000, I have $8,000 left over. But that's my cost to produce it. We just don't think about it that way in the legal business and the legal industry, because that's A, not how we've been trained to do it, and B, it's not how we're used to doing it. We have a huge population of people who have never thought, and in many cases still don't think, about the cost to provide something. We have a world in which firms are providing or have clients who will generate $8 million of revenue and only 20% margin, and another client who will generate $4 million of revenue and a 50% margin, and the firm will value the higher revenue rather than the lower revenue, even though it makes less money, and pulls down its overall margin because they don't value the margin. They don't understand the margin so much as they understand the revenue, the top line. So some of it is just simply how we've looked at things for a long time and trying to change our thinking into a way that's what I call a more normalized business model.
Well, to a certain extent, it seems to me that law firms do take cost into effect the way you describe. When you think of at least in terms of associates, right? Attorney associates, they have a salary, and typically they have annual requirements for their hours, or annual targets for their hours. And presumably, that's based on, okay, well, if this person bills 2,000 hours this year and their rate is going to be, $400 an hour, then the revenue will be X associated with this associate, right? Our expenses and salary and office, etc., will be Y, and so that's why we make the hourly target this as opposed to something lower. I wonder, especially since law firms can measure their costs based on time, based on a scale of time. The longer something's happening, the more expensive it becomes. How do you separate the price from that type of cost analysis?
Yeah, I would look at that situation very differently, because let's say, use your scenario. We have an associate. We're paying the easy numbers. We're paying the associate $100,000 a year, and we set a billable hour target of 2,000 hours a year. So we multiply out times their rate. We say this is how much revenue they will generate, minus the cost of the associate plus their office and other things. This is how much profit. And I would look at it and say, I want to be able to accomplish X amount of work of value, and then I want to be able to bill that value rather than hours. I want to bill the value. That associate, if he or she was doing more work and less waste, I might be able to charge on a value model twice as much as I could get on an hourly model, because instead of spending half their time wasted, they're doing higher work content, and I can get more value by charging for it. So a model that I would frequently use is, it takes 12 hours to do something. You charge $100 an hour. That's $1,200 cost to the client. If you can figure out how to do the same thing in 6 hours, you now have the option of charging the client $1,200, and it's only taking you 6 hours. And you can take the 6 hours you just gained in inventory and bill that out to another client, so you could make $2,400 for 12 hours of work. Or you could reduce the cost to your client, maybe take it from $1,200 to $900. So you're making $900 on 6 hours of work, which means you just made 50% more on the 6 hours of work. And you still have 6 hours in inventory that you could use for another client. And so now you have 12 hours again, but you're making $1,800. So you start seeing how the power of going from an hourly rate to a value rate means you're driving the costs down within the firm, and the firm is able to make more money. And at the same time, you can actually bring the price down to your client. So a firm can make more money on a certain amount of cost, and the client can pay less money and get the same value it got before, by going from an effort-focused, wasteful model to a value-focused, less wasteful model. And that's what businesses do every single day. It's what I did when I was in a stint as a business person. And so that's the difference between looking at it as a fixed thing, hours times a rate, versus a value thing.
Certainly, especially in your scenario, Ken, it could incentivize the wrong type of behavior. It could incentivize somebody to be less efficient, take more time, which, adds cost to the entire process. Something that I have troubles wrapping my head around, and this sort of touches upon that, is what's the client actually buying? What's the deliverable in the attorney-client context? And in my mind, the client is buying sort of a little timeshare in their trusted attorney's brain to pick at, as things come up. I'm curious, maybe that's not what is universally understood as what the client's buying. Ken, what's your take on, what that client is purchasing?
I think it's understandable that you would view it that way, because again, it's sort of the way we've been trained to think about things. We're renting people's time. We're renting a portion of their working life to help us do things. I think of it in terms of problem solving, because what I'm looking for when I go to an attorney is, I have a problem, it needs a solution, and I'm going to a person who has a set of tools that seem appropriate to solve the problem. That tool set, I would like them to use efficiently. Just like if I hire a carpenter, I want him to use his tools efficiently. I want the attorney to use her tools efficiently in solving my problem. I am willing to pay a certain amount of money to have my problem solved. Beyond that, I'm not willing to pay to have the problem solved. Okay? That is based in part on an evaluation of the risk associated with the problem. So if it's litigation, we tend to think, well, I don't have a choice. I have to hire a lawyer to represent us in litigation, but I do have choices. I can choose to hire a top-end litigation firm and pay a very high cost. I can choose a middle-level firm. I could choose a small boutique office, and there are various price points associated with those. And at some point, I'll say, this is a too expensive solution, I'll go to a less expensive solution. But that's what I'm really looking for. I'm looking for a solution. And I want value I want to pay value for that solution, and I don't want to overpay value for the solution. The thing that we've confused is, how do I know that I'm, the fundamental question that always comes up in this, how do I know that I'm not overpaying and that I am therefore getting the short end of the stick in this bargain because I'm paying you more than I would have paid somebody else to get the value? And from the firm's perspective, how am I not getting the short end of the stick because I just charged you less than I should have for the value I delivered? And so this is sort of the fundamental thing that we think the billable hour solves for us, because it sounds so objective. I know I can take this amount of hours times this rate. Sounds like a very objective calculation, and therefore I know I paid the right amount because I paid for the amount of hours that you invested in doing this. Even though you may have taken 3 times as many hours to do this as somebody else might have, I can't evaluate that. I don't have a way of looking at that under today's model. So I'm willing to say, as long as the math works, I'm okay. And the way that I'm trying to back into the content question is, well, if I look at enough cases, I'll get a feel for, did you spend way more time than the average person, the average lawyer does on this? So this becomes benchmarking and sort of takes us into the concept of shadow billing. If you took 60 hours to do something and everybody else seems to take 30 hours to do it, then I'll feel I've spent too much on you, because for some reason it took you twice as long as on average it takes to do this task. And so my benchmark says I'm overpaying you. Now, that gives us a false sense of security because we don't know the exact content that went into what you did. We don't know the content that went into these other cases. We don't know that it's the same. We don't know the differences. All we know is this supposedly objective measure, twice as many hours as this. And without knowing anything else, we make an assumption that twice as many must have been too many because others are spending 30 hours. So it keeps going back to this fundamental concept of we're using this easy to calculate thing and substituting it for understanding the content value of what's being done to get this sense of security out of everything.
And it seems to me that the hourly billing, you mentioned solution and what's the value to achieve this solution. It seems like the hourly billing would help the law firms in a situation where, there is no solution and you didn't get a good outcome, but not of any fault of yourselves, just because it was a difficult situation and you were trying to help the client. In those situations where the client didn't get the results he or she hoped for, the hourly amount would certainly help justify the law firm's position that we still have to get paid for this. If you look at that from a value billing perspective, the client, I wonder if the client will ever feel that they got value for a bad solution. So if the argument is to give them value for what they spend, and that's what should keep everybody satisfied and efficient and moving towards the same goal, what about in situations where the client will likely never feel like they got value for what they spent because they got a bad result?
Well, clients often don't feel they got value when they got a good result, and it's hard to argue that we'll use litigation, which is sort of the underlying premise of what we're talking about, though it applies to every other area. I start from the premise that litigation is in itself waste. Okay? It is a failure of the process that we're starting from, because if we did the process well, we wouldn't have had a failure called litigation. And so once we're there, now we're just spending a lot of money on something that doesn't add value. It just is a wasteful process in and of itself. Clients frequently feel when they win a lawsuit that they didn't get value out of it. I mean, if you're a defendant in a lawsuit, you seldom feel like, wow, I got a lot of value here by spending a lot of money defending a position that I thought was correct to begin with. And if you're a plaintiff, you frequently may win the lawsuit, but it may not be the victory that you wanted because the amount of money that you recover or the relief that you get isn't what you had hoped for. So you spend a lot of money, but you're dissatisfied or you didn't feel like you got the value because you didn't really achieve all the goals that you would have liked to have achieved. So there's in all of those cases this less than euphoric feeling. Sometimes you do get a feeling as a plaintiff that you got everything that you thought you deserved, and sometimes, though I'd say much more rarely, defendants feel like they achieve some sort of victory in the outcome, and so they feel that there's value there. But it's frequent that you're going to see that sort of mismatch. I disagree that there's situation there are problems where there may not be sort of the nice near wrap solution. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a solution that you're given. This is a set of facts. This is the best that you can do. Given this set of facts, we will help you accomplish the best that you can do. It may not absolve you of all guilt or problems or whatever may be coming out of it, but the solution you're looking for is what is the best that I can do given this certain fact situation, and you're willing to pay a certain amount of value to get that. It's not that we don't use value. We use value all the time in a billable hour model. We're constantly talking about value in a billable hour model. We've just adopted a mechanism that is convenient, it's readily available, it's been around for a while, and it's, in the grand scheme of things, simple to understand and use as our means of calculating that value. And we recognize that it's an imperfect one. It's a coarse measure of it, but we're willing to use that versus a more, what I would argue is a more accurate measure of getting to value, but one that takes more effort, more time, more trust and other things to get to initially and to change over. And so, you know, we're using a proxy. And a lot of people feel the proxy is fine and they're willing to go with it. The only problem is when we go from that proxy model to a more accurate model, and when I've done this and others I know have done this, we can reduce the cost very rapidly by 50% more. And so if you're working on the billable hour model and you tell me it costs $100,000 and I go in and do a value-based content model, I can pretty rapidly get it down to $50,000 or more. And so what we're doing is we're willing to overpay by a significant amount for ease of use. And that may have value. You know, that may be in and of itself something that's valuable. I'd rather do it the easy way, the simple way, and pay twice as much than do it the harder way and a more accurate way and pay half as much. And companies have been willing to do that.
What role do you think that shadow billing is going to play in using it to ramp up to speed when first embarking on the implementation of the value-based billing model? Do you see that is something that is useful? Can it be detrimental to the relationship? What are your thoughts on that in the initial stages as we move towards this ideal type of value-based billing? Where does shadow billing play a role?
The challenge with the shadow billing is, and I'm using this, you know, it's sort of the hyperbolic sense to make the point, and I understand that, but if you accept the premise that hourly billing is not a good model because it's a very wasteful, high-cost model, if you then measure your value fee against a high-cost, wasteful model using the shadow billing, what you're going to end up with is a comparison where you're trying to say, is my more efficient, better model as inefficient as the high-cost, ineffective model? And so the idea is, instead of thinking of the effort-based model, you need to move to not an effort but a content-based model. And a content-based model isn't appropriate to bounce against the effort-based model because it's a different measure. It's a measure based on a different concept, and so they're not comparable outcomes. And so it gets very confusing. The second thing that we've found, just as a practical matter when you use shadow billing, is what I'll call the human nature effect. The firm is going to feel uncomfortable if the shadow bill shows a high deviation to the value. So if the shadow bill, let's say the value bill is $50,000 and the shadow bill shows $20,000. You go to the client and you're back in the situation that I discussed before. The client's going to say, wow, I just overpaid by $30,000. Now that may be incorrect because value isn't based on effort. Value is based on, I put in a certain amount of content, you got an outcome that was desirable, you were willing to pay $50,000 for it, therefore on a value model that makes sense, and it's not an effort question. Equally, the next time around, the firm may put in $70,000 worth of content and only get $50,000. The firm might say, gee, I just overproduced, I put in too much content and compared to the value I got, and so the client feels like it's benefited and the firm didn't. It's not an apples to apples comparison, it's an apples to oranges comparison, which is why we typically recommend that if you're getting into value-based billing, you look at it initially on a portfolio model, because you will find as you're learning a new habit, it's learning to measure things differently, it's training new muscles. It means that sometimes you will be off high, sometimes you will be off low. As time goes on, your accuracy will improve because you're learning how to measure content more accurately. But initially, you're going to have hits and misses each way. And so if you do it on a portfolio model, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose over the course of the portfolio. It will even out, and you'll have become much better at doing this. But if you go back to measuring against effort, you're not really doing value anymore. You're just trying to benchmark yourself against the old model, and that doesn't do anything. And it creates bad behaviors.
Well, one thing that we've learned at Viewabill, over the course of the past couple of years, is that to affect change in the legal industry, you need equal buy-in from the client side and from the law firm side, and things can only move forward if the two sides move it forward together. When we talk about shadow billing, what I think about is it's not a way for the firms or the clients to use as leverage against each other, but it's a way for them to be, they're sophisticated clients, sophisticated firms who are operating this kind of method. It's a way for them to say, look, I'm going into this type of arrangement with the understanding that you win some, you lose some. But for me to go into it with that understanding, I have to show that that's the case. This has to be a win for me, not just in terms of, did I get value out of a particular engagement, but is this a good decision financially to go with the alternative fee arrangements across our legal portfolio? And not financially in terms of, are you winning every time, but does it actually hold true that you win some and you lose some? And if so, then we're willing to take that risk, because that's the value that we're willing to buy into.
I agree with the premise. It's just the approach goes back to it's the right idea, but it's the wrong approach to get there. As a firm, when you're providing a service, you have a whole group of costs, just like anybody else does who provides the service or a product. Some of that is associates, some of it's overhead, some of it is the secretaries or other assistants. There's a number of inputs that you should be capturing to figure out your cost of service produced. And if you want to demonstrate that your cost of service produced is at a certain level for what you delivered to the client, that's fine. Ours and a billable hour model doesn't do that. It measures effort, not cost of the inputs. So look at the cost of the inputs and be able to discuss the cost of the inputs and be able to discuss why you charge what you charge for the final service given the cost of the inputs. And now you're having a transparent discussion that is meaningful with the client. When you look at the effort model, you're not having that discussion because you're not even aware of what the cost of your inputs are and what it cost you to provide the service. It may have cost you $5,000 to provide the service, but if you're compensating your associates based on hours, they may have put in $15,000 worth of time because they get compensated for more time. So it's these mismatches throughout the system. We're not measuring what we think we're measuring. We're not calculating what we think we're calculating that drive us to bad outcomes versus if we want to have a transparent discussion, fine. Let's sit down and say, as a manufacturer, I could sit down and say, this is what it cost me to produce this product. I can measure it. I know what the inputs are. I know what the output is. And so between those two, I can tell you this is why we charge what we charge for our product. And I had those conversations all the time. I would bet that if you talk to most partners, they have no idea what it costs them to produce their service. They only know what the revenue opportunity is for the service, not the cost. And that's very typical amongst law firm partners, that they have no idea what the cost is of the service. They only know what the revenue opportunity is for the service.
So to empower clients to make the switch to value-based billing, and to empower partners to want to view things differently, how do we make that case for them without essentially showing them a pro forma to say, look, under the new regime, we're making this and the client is benefiting X amount. Under the old regime, you could see all the inefficiencies in there, which is why the new regime is that much better. I think it's important that we, as an industry, that we empower those decisions. How do you think that we could, arm the law firms and the clients with enough information to be comfortable with moving away from the billable hour?
Well, you have to, the fundamental changes that you have to make, and let me step sideways for a moment and then come back. Given that we have still a predominantly billable hour system, I have no problem with doing metrics around billable hours, keeping track of it, you got to monitor it, all those things. I think that's fine, given that you're using that system. My argument is we shouldn't be using that system, but given that we are, I would also not advocate, it is what it is, don't keep track of it, don't look at it, don't benchmark it or anything else. My argument is a preferred, let's move away from it and use something that's better. Now, sort of stepping back to answer your question, the fundamental problem that everybody talks about, you can't even say it's the elephant in the room because everybody knows it's there and talks about it in the room, is the compensation system. Firms are based on a compensation system that drives a certain behavior. They're based primarily or fundamentally on a billable hour system. So if you want your compensation to be high and get higher, we're going to look to how many hours you're billing, how much revenue is being generated through that billable hour model. And as long as firms do that, everybody is going to respond to that as the measurement within the firm by trying to drive the metric that drives their compensation. So the first thing we all recognize is getting off billable hour as the metric for compensation is very important if you want to go to any other type of measurement. If you do that, then the next thing is to look at this work content, or what I would call the value stream, and measure that across the firm, the company, and any other elements that are involved in delivering the service today to the clients. The client is willing to pay a certain amount of money for the solution to its problem. That may involve an e-discovery vendor, an LPO, a law firm, et cetera, and we need to look at the whole value stream and what the costs are through the value stream, and then where law firms should be working with their client is how can we drive down the cost to our client of the value stream, and we charge an acceptable profit on top of that. Now, what's acceptable? Well, the firm and the client may disagree on what an acceptable profit is, and that's something for the marketplace to decide. If the firm thinks it should earn a 40% margin and a client thinks it should earn only a 30% margin, the client will go to somebody else who can provide the same value with a 30% margin on top. And that's a marketplace decision. But the firm will argue that it's providing a certain value, and in exchange for that, it's entitled to a certain amount of money as its profit on top of providing the value. But you have to get people aligned around the value that's being done, the work, the content, the actual thing that's being paid for, as opposed to the amount of effort that goes into the thing that's being done, because effort doesn't really give us anything, but the actual, this is the input to generate the thing, the service, is what drives value. And that's where you want to have the discussion going. And that's where you see companies and firms that are implementing lean models, where they're actually sitting down and they're talking about who does what and what the content is, and what things don't add value, and work through that model, have more success and more comfortable relationships on value-based models, because they're talking about the content. They're not just talking about hours or perceived amount of hours it should take to do something, because the perception of the amount of hours doesn't really add value. It doesn't do us much. So you've got to get down to a different mindset, a different way of looking at things, and that's the part of the stumbling block. That's a change. It's not how lawyers were trained to do things. Change involves risk. Risk is not something lawyers like to do. You have to have support in order to do this. So within the firm, you have to have the support of your compensation committee to use this different approach. Within the company, you have to have the support of the general counsel to use this different approach. And you have to be willing to invest the time to work through the inevitable bumps as you introduce this. Why would you do any of it? You do it because from the company's standpoint, you're going to find, like every other industry has found, as every other industry has implemented this, a significant reduction in your costs to get the value that you seek. So your costs go way down, meaning the amount of money you're spending to get the value. Why would you do it as a firm? Because as a firm, your goal should be to be an efficient provider of the service to the client. And if you're more efficient than the other guy, other clients will want to use you, and you should be superior in the marketplace. You deliver value more affordably for a better cost than the other guy does. And for most legal services, that will be attractive. We will have the bet the company case, the bet the company litigation, where companies are price insensitive, and we'll put those aside for the moment. The model still works there, but we'll put them aside as a special case. Well, for most legal services, you want to be the guy who can provide very high quality services more cost efficiently than the other guy, and you would charge an appropriate amount on top to stay in business and earn a living that the people who provide the service are willing to accept.
But in order for us to move to this regime, and you alluded to it earlier, it requires us to rethink the entire infrastructure that's been built around the legal system, in the past 100 years. And it sounds to me that, sure, if a business mindset, comes in, starts a new firm from scratch, they would make very different decisions, and they would probably build a value-based pricing system exactly as you described. But short of letting businesses own and run law firms, and short of blowing up the infrastructure and starting over, I think there's just a practical transitional question of what do we do between now and then, and do we just pull the Band-Aid off and say you're either on value-based billing or you're on hourly billing, or do we allow for a transition where the early adopters are able to run sort of simultaneous tests or shadow billing, and prove that value-based billing is better, and over time more people will follow down that route and will be at value-based billing. I just think that there's a practical problem with the transition.
It's not so much a practical problem as it is a change management issue you have to deal with. So if I'm at a company, and there are many companies that have done this, I could opt for version 1, which is, many companies having done this, is change completely to value billing. So many companies have done that. If I'm a general counsel, my options are don't do it at all. Just stay on the billable hour. Second one is start doing it for certain matters. And the third one is pull the Band-Aid and go to value billing across the board. The model that we see most people going with is the middle one, where they're doing some value billing. They haven't gone completely to value billing, but they've also moved some things off of the billable hour. So today, I think most companies have done some experiments with value-based billing, and then there's sort of a bell curve. You know, very few in the total billable hour, relatively few at the total value fee arrangement. Most of them are in that middle area where they've done some and maybe increasing it or not or wherever. And that, I think, is the change management issue for your environment. So we'll put aside the ones who say, I am not going to go off the billable hour, because for every change that we go through, there's a certain percentage that say, I absolutely refuse to change, and you know, the market is going to support them or not. Either they'll be the stragglers who eventually one day have to change, or get weeded out, or they'll be able to find some way to exist in a universe that has changed around them. We won't know that until the future. So let's focus on the ones who are changing. In certain environments, and those often are smaller law departments, it can be easier to pull the Band-Aid and go to all value fee, because you have a smaller group of people, you can educate them, and then you can align your processes around using value-based fees. When you have a larger department, you know, where you have 100, 200, X hundred number of lawyers and other professionals in your law department, it can be harder to do because it is a changeover in your processes from the way it was before to a new way, and that's educating people, it's reinforcing the message, it may be changing technological systems and doing a whole bunch of other things. So part of this comes down to what type of change are you able to accomplish within your environment. Part of it comes down to the nature of the work that you provide and, or the consume rather, in the marketplace. If you consume a very specialized type of work, then it may be slower going with your outside providers if they're resisting doing the change. If you consume a very generic type of legal work, you may have more options in the market for providers and find more opportunities for ones that will work with you on doing value fees. But it's this very massive, I mean, we're talking about changing an industry. We're not talking about changing a company. And so changing the industry, especially one that is change resistant, is going to take time, and it's going to be a slow process, and it will, you know, advance as it usually does. There'll be fits and starts here and successes there, and some people will do this and hate it because maybe they didn't implement it well, maybe they implemented it in the wrong situation, a whole host of reasons. So it's going to be an uneven advancement. Over time, though, I think it's going to be hard for general counsel, as they see successes mount, as they see competitors and companies who are able to successfully reduce their costs by really significant numbers. I'm not talking about a 5% incremental improvement, but I'm talking about these huge changes in percentage of cost to the company. It's going to be very difficult to say, I'm going to stay with the model that's the higher cost one, not the lower cost one. And you know, it's going to continue having an impact because of an area we haven't even talked about, and that is technology. So, you know, if we build by the hour and we take technology into account, e-discovery would never work, because e-discovery can do in the space of a short period of time what it used to take tens or even hundreds of people to do in a very long period of time. When I started out, I was a paralegal. And so back in the 70s, you'd sit down and you'd read each document, and you'd stamp a number on each document, and you'd dictate into your dictaphone what the information was about the document, and the secretary would type it up. That model today would be ludicrous to do because we have tools that will scan the document, they'll do predictive coding on the document, and they'll determine whether the document should be produced. And it takes a fraction of the amount of time for the computer to do that it used to take me to do that. But if we build that on a billable hour model, it would never work. The e-discovery vendors would go out of business overnight. They bill it on a value model. And so as legal work transitions from the person doing it with an effort model to a computer doing some of it with a value model, document assembly, logic tree programs that will go through and help with question and answers, triage programs that evaluate incoming materials, as those take root in what we do, we won't be able to do that on a billable hour model. We won't be able to do a cost comparison between A and B on a billable hour model. So it's naturally going to move to a different cost and revenue structure, and that will impact the rate of change. So this to me is a very complicated and time-involving change management issue, but it's one that's going to happen regardless of whether we think it's a good thing or not a good thing, because even though just by itself, technology is going to force it.
Right, and you know, information will help people understand the value, you know, and you know, it will help with pricing and the client's perception of value. And I agree with you that technology is going to increase the likelihood of value-based billing, and time is also going to, you know, increase the likelihood or our move towards value-based billing. I think that, you know, and this is sort of just to sum up my position, I think that during that transition period, the more open we could be as an industry about the benefits of moving towards value-based billing, the stronger it's going to make that case. Because I agree that if all information were perfect, value-based billing would be better. You know, we're always going to have an information problem, just whatever the case may be. And in the meantime, you know, or as we evaluate the size of that problem, having a way to evaluate the opportunity there is an important step as well. And that's where I think shadow billing comes in.
Robbie and Ken, I know we're going late on time. I have one last question, and I don't know, are we out of time, or I'd love to get your philosophical opinion about this, and you'll let me know if it's something for another time or not. But let's say in an ideal situation that we were able to come up with a value-based model for the arrangement that just worked on all sides. How would you feel about the client still requesting to see the hours that the firm put in? You know, I guess we'd call it, you know, the shadow billing alongside the value-based, just because not necessarily they want to see if they're getting value, but they're curious about what the profit margin is on the firm side. Do you feel from an ethical standpoint that the firm has to be transparent about its profit margins to the client? I know the reason I bring this up, there was an interview on the Bloomberg Big Law website with the COO for Colliers. His name is Alex Baer. And he felt that he wanted to develop an open book relationship and find out, you know, get a real feel for what the law firm hopes for in terms of profit margin and revenue. And that financial transparency that insight from the client side to what the profit margin the firm is making off the client. Do you feel that that's something that is a responsibility for the firm to provide to the client if they request it, or is that something that is maybe pushing the envelope in terms of requesting what their firms do for them? Is that something that you come across, Ken? Have you seen that discussion brought up, or?
Well, it's a couple of answers to it. As a GC, I never felt that it was my job to manage the economics of all the service providers to the company. I felt that it was a big enough job to manage what I needed to manage for the company, and my way of controlling my costs was not to try and manage the economics of a law firm, but rather to let the law firms manage their economics and do so in a way that if I felt firm A wasn't delivering me the value that I wanted for the cost I was willing to pay, then I'd find firm B that was willing to do that. And so that was my job, to look at the providers out there and choose amongst them, getting the right mix of quality and value and cost. So I don't feel that it's the job of a GC to dictate to a firm what profit margin it can make in doing things. But your question started with, what about getting just the hours? Now, I did do, when I was a general counsel, and I would, when I was using the value fees, I asked to see the hours, but not the rates and not the math, but the hours. And I wanted the hours because I wanted to try and figure out how we, in working with the firm, could become more efficient in doing things. Was the firm doing things that were better off done by my department because we were able to access the information better? We had people who could more efficiently do that task because of training, because of skill set, whatever it might be, than people in the firm. And equally, I wanted to figure out whether there were things we were doing that should have been on the firm. And I also wanted to look at, why is it taking 10 hours to do something that we seem like we should be able to accomplish in fewer hours, because that's costing the firm a lot to spend 10 hours on something if it can only spend 5 hours. So I was looking at it from a productivity efficiency standpoint, which meant the rate wasn't the relevant thing to me because I was paying a fixed fee. It was a value fee arrangement. What I was looking at is getting the work content under control, finding variances in it, et cetera. So in effect, I was asking to look at the data to do what I wanted the firm to be doing. And I felt that was useful for both of us to try and drive down the work content. But the margin is, I think GCs go a bit too far when they're trying to figure out what the margin is of a firm. If you feel the firm is charging you too much based on what you're getting from them, it's a very competitive market nowadays, unless they offer a unique service for which they can charge a premium. Then there are plenty of other providers who you can go to get the work done at a lower cost, and you have to measure the quality to make sure you're getting at least the same quality level you were getting before. And that's true. Again, there's this, what is it that's unique about the legal industry compared to everything else that's out there that makes us feel we should have to do it differently than everything else in the world? What drives us to this belief that we're different than everyone else? And I haven't been able to find that articulated yet. So I haven't been able to buy into the concept that we need to do that. I think that's the firm's job to do. And I think over time, firms will find ways to compete on that basis. They're efficient, they're effective, and just like in every other industry where they can come in and say, this is what I can deliver. Let me show you why I can deliver it. Let me show you examples of my being able to deliver it. This is how much I'll charge for it. And they'll provide their service at that cost. And someone will undercut the other guy because they figured out how to do it at higher quality for lower cost. And there's an abundance of ways to do that right now in the legal industry. The reason that it's not happening, and the firms are very upfront about this, the reason they're not changing is the clients are not pushing them to change. I mean, that is over and over and over again. We hear that from managing partners, from partners in the firms. They're not changing because the firms or the clients are not pushing them to change. If a client demands something from a firm, they will usually work to accommodate that. But for the most part, they're not being pushed to do that, and so they see no reason to go there. They're making a lot of money, and why should they change their model if nobody's pushing them to do it?
So Ken, this brings me around to, you know, I think you and I sort of end up in exactly the same place. You know, when we talk about shadow billing versus shadow hours, I should clarify. I do not think that tracking the shadow rates is very important. I do think that tracking, you know, in a shadow basis, the hours and activity is the key thing, because then what you're able to assess potentially is, you know, efficiency and resource allocation, etc. And because change comes from the clients, and we have to make clients want to push their firms, because every time a client is going to try to push the envelope of their firms, you know, in their minds, they're risking some political capital or some goodwill with that firm. You know, they don't think that the firm is going to feel that they're doing this just cause. So, you know, it goes back to my point of empowering the client to help the industry move forward. You know, just like you wanted to see those hours so that you could feel, you know, that you had some way to gauge, you know, even if by your own metrics, you know, gauge the value of the engagement. And that helped you feel that value-based billing was better. You know, that's what I think we need to apply across the board at this point.
Yeah, and the one thing I agree with you, but I want to clarify. I wasn't using it to measure the value of the engagement. I agreed to pay a certain amount of money. That was the value of the engagement. What I wanted was an efficient use of the resources I had available.
Yes.
I was already paying the money.
Yep.
Efficiency in the use of the resources meant I had resources. I had people. I had other resources that I was using. I wanted to check that and use metrics to improve the efficiency. The value that I was paying was the dollars that I agreed for a lump of services out the door. And I think it's a nuance that is just so, you know, it's hard for people to get their mind around the fact that because hours are such the predominant measure, that by hours we can mean something other than times rate equals value. And it's, no, hours meant cost. And cost is something that I always want to drive down. I always want to bring to the lowest level. And so I'm perfectly willing to focus on cost. But the revenue part of the equation was not the, and that was cost to the producer, and I was part of the producer, and the law firm was part of the producer, and together we were the value stream. So we needed to look at both parts. We couldn't just look at one or the other. So I think that's the, you know, it's a nuance, but it's an important nuance. And you know, right now we are where we are. Value fees are still a minority compared to the billable hour. You would be a fool not to track hours, to pay attention to them, to benchmark them, because if that's what you're using and you don't pay attention to those metrics, then you really are not managing your business. So, you know, it's if this is what we're doing, then do it well, and then look for a better way to do it. And if you find a better way to do it, then do that well. I argue that value fees are the better way to do it. We should do that well, but I recognize that we're doing the billable hours, so we should do that well while we're doing it. And we should be very careful about monitoring it and using metrics and doing benchmarking and so on with it.
And so maybe value, maybe value-based billing is sort of a misnomer because, I think a lot of people think of it as, value being sort of the goodness that I get out of it. And, when I say value, I might be including the goodness of efficiency or, the benefit of an easy working engagement. That all goes into some people's definition of value. And
it should. It should, because
although value billing refers to, and correct me if I'm wrong, but, the value that you're referring to is sort of the cost. And value in that sense is not going to change. You agree to amount, you're going to pay that amount, fine. But
no, I'm not using value to equal cost.
Okay.
Cost is cost. Cost is cost. What I will do is give you something, and in exchange you will give me something. I will give you a service, and in exchange you will give me money. That's a value exchange. If you feel the service I gave you, which is broadly defined to mean not just the physical aspects of it, but the peace of mind, all the other things that come with it. If you feel that package is worth a lump sum of money and you're willing to pay me that lump sum of money for what I deliver to you, then we've had an equal value exchange. I mean, this sort of goes back to some of the funny stories that you hear about kids. The boy who has a baseball card that is signed by the player that his dad thinks is worth a lot of money, and it is, and the boy trades it to his friend for his friend's bike, which is worth a lot less. Okay? In the child's mind, it was a value exchange. I gave you something that I valued at a certain level. You gave me something back that I valued at a certain level. We both feel good about it. Okay? That was an even value exchange. To the father, it wasn't an even value exchange. You just gave away a $1,000 baseball card for a $50 bike. But the boys felt it was a good value exchange. I may give you certain services as a firm, and those services are very easy for us to look at, to cost out, to figure out. But with it, I'm also giving you the reputation of my firm because I did the work versus somebody else. And my reputation may be very valuable on the market. And so I will charge a premium for your renting my reputation as part of this value exchange. You may feel perfectly good about paying a large amount of money to get my reputation in addition to the services that I did, which had relatively low costs associated with them. But that's fine. You paid a value you were willing to pay, and I provided the services and the reputation. I was willing to rent my reputation.
Right. Although, but it's, that relationship or that exchange of value is determined at the outset, not retroactively. So after the engagement, there's a certain, debrief of what was the true value. And I do think that sometimes people, myself included, we use value to refer sometimes to retrospectively, what was my value, and sometimes prospectively, what is this value arrangement?
Well, we use language very loosely in the legal industry, strangely enough, and we use terms without fully understanding what we mean when we use them, because this is a lot of things that we're unfamiliar with. But again, it's because we sort of think of ourselves as unique when we're not. When I was a lawyer in-house, I had companies all the time that would come to us and make the following proposition. We will charge you X amount of dollars for a license to use our software. We will give you a 10% discount if you allow us to use your company's name in our advertising material, okay? Because they valued being able to rent the name of the company as part of their marketing pitch. So they were willing to take less money as part of the value exchange. They were willing to rent our company name. So money plus our company name was the value that they were getting. That made perfect sense to them. And if we said, no, you can't use our name, then it was going to cost us 10% more. So value happens every day out in the marketplace in terms of exchanges, with part of it being the cost of the components and part of it being the reputation, that's the intangibles that are associated with it. You know, the cost of the components in an iPhone are a lot less than what gets charged for an iPhone, because you're paying for a variety of other things when you buy an iPhone, and the same is true with other things that are out there. The cost of Coca-Cola isn't measured just by the cost of the ingredients. So we pay for intangibles all the time when we buy things, and that's part of the value exchange, and it works perfectly fine in the legal services industry as well. But then it's also a recognition that cost is one component, these intangibles are another component, and I, as the seller, believe I can charge a certain amount in the market. You will pay me a certain amount to get that mix. If I'm right, you'll pay me. If I'm wrong, you won't. You'll go to somebody else. If I'm wrong often enough, I go out of business. But I don't, go back to the initial, I don't feel the need as a general counsel that I have to manage that. I simply say, you're charging too much, I'll go use somebody else. And I can do that right now. I hear all the time this argument that, well, I may offend my law firm if I do X, Y, and Z. And you will hear a whole number of us who have been on panels and everything else say, well, that's perfectly fine, unless you need them for something unique, unless they provide a difficult-to-find service you can't get elsewhere, then by all means go to somebody else.
Right.
And that's fine. They will learn then that they don't have you as a captive client, and they don't have something special that they're offering, and the next time around they'll be more amenable to discussing with you, or they won't be there next time around.
Right.
But I think.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I didn't mean to.
I was going to say, I just sort of get back to the general topic here. The concept of using hours is there, and so we have to deal with that. And the concept of using hours means you got to manage that process. Are there other ways to manage value? I think most people would agree there are other ways, and then they debate whether they like those ways, whether they're effective, and how much effort they take. And the ultimate determinant here is going to be whether this model or any other is more effective in providing value to clients as you go through this time of transition. And if it's more effective, then people will adopt a different model. And if it's not more effective, they'll stay with the current one. So my guess overall is we're going to see a slow transition to more of what we call the value fee arrangements. And that slow transition is going to eventually stabilize. And we'll probably see some level of value fees out there and some level of billable hours out there. And the ultimate driver that will change the whole equation will be technology, and that's probably far down the road when that's going to impact everything to a degree where value fees or billable hours get altered significantly by technology.
Got it. Well, thank you very, very much for joining us, Ken, and Robbie as well. You've given us some real insights into the value-based model, and it seems like something that really everybody can agree to. The question is what to do in the meantime until we get there, and how to manage it the best way that we can. Ken, I just want to plug your website because, your blog rather, Sightlines, SEYTLINES.com. It's one of the great blogs that I follow, and I really get, at risk of throwing out another pun, I get a lot of value out of it. And I really enjoy it, and I think that it's something that anybody who's listening should, if they're not already following, should go there and follow it. There's some fantastic thought leadership articles there, and again, Robbie, thank you. Our website, Viewabill.com. If you'd like to see what we do, you can visit www.viewabill.com. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was great talking.
And to be continued.
Okay, sounds good.
Bye-bye. Thanks, guys.
Okay, take care.
Bye.